welcome to part 2 of Fulfilled, Not Forsaken. And in this second part, we'll be looking at language. And so in the first part, we looked at scripture, and through those scriptures, we understood that not only is Yeshua Hamashiach one with the Father, but he came to fulfill a destiny in accordance with the will of the Father, in full knowledge of that will and in full knowledge of the destiny he needed to fulfill according to the will. So, and we also saw that many scriptures contend with the interpretation, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because there are a multitude of verses and scriptures that say that Yah does not leave or forsake those that are faithful to him. And so how could he possibly have forsaken the most anointed, Yeshua Hamashiach, the one which he specifically said, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." So the next aspect we're going to look at beyond scripture is language. And like I mentioned in the previous part to this series, that I am no professional linguist at all, but I will be showing you some of the resources that I found that kind of help me put these pieces together. So I'm just going to present this before you, and like I say, always study to show yourself approved, and before you believe anything I say, study for your own self and seek out knowledge in accordance to the truth of the Most High Yah. And as always, the Holy Spirit will guide you and teach you in those pursuits. So within language, we will specifically be looking at the concept of a transliteration, and then we'll also be looking at historically what languages were actually spoken by Yeshua Hamashiach during his life as a man on earth. So the sentence we are dealing with here, or the phrase, is Eli Eli Lama Sabachtani. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a transliteration. So what is a transliteration? Well, I have the definition here, and a transliteration is basically the spelling of a foreign word in one's native alphabet to preserve the sound rather than meaning of the word or phrase. And so as you can see in this sentence here, these are clearly English letters from an English alphabet, but these are obviously not English words. So I can pronounce this sentence or this phrase a million times and probably not say it completely correctly, but I do have the ability to pronounce it, but I could not tell you what it means using the English language. So I'm going to have to find out what language this is being spoken in order to find the meaning of the phrase. And so we're going to be playing kind of like a game of telephone in order to take this sound of this transliteration and try to discover its meaning. And the first thing we have to do with that is identify the language that Yeshua was speaking when this came out of his mouth. So we have this transliteration written in English, and just to show you that I didn't make this definition up, we're going to look up this definition of a transliteration, and it is as follows. Transliteration is the process of transferring a word from the alphabet of one language to another. Or this is actually a better question here. What's the difference between a transliteration and a translation? A transliteration doesn't tell you the meaning of the word. So we're trying to take this transliteration and find the meaning of the word through the translation. But we have to translate it from the correct language. There were three languages that were being spoken in Israel during the life of Yeshua Hamashiach. The first of those is Greek, and that is due to the Roman Empire that is in power during the time of Yeshua Hamashiach. And so this is known as like the imperial dialect. So a lot of business transactions would be spoken in Greek, a lot of governance sectors, the language of Greek would be spoken, etc., in those kind of formal and stately arenas. The next language that was spoken is Hebrew, And Hebrew obviously is due to the fact that these are the Hebrew people. So they did have a certain specific language, but by this time it was mostly reserved for religious services or reading of scriptures or other things associated with the practice of the Hebrew faith. So it was mostly used in these as a religious dialect. And then lastly, we have Aramaic, which was the most commonly spoken language during the life of Yeshua Hamashiach. And this is what I'm referring to as the local dialect, because this is what, on the day-to-day basis, to your common neighbors and friends and family, that they were mostly speaking in Aramaic dialect. So, one may ask, how did the Hebrew people begin speaking Aramaic? Well, from a simple search on Britannica, of the Aramaic language, we have a quick synopsis of its history. So I'm just going to read part of this here. So, Aramaic language, Semitic language of the northern, central, or northwestern group that was originally spoken by the Middle Eastern people known as Arameans. It was most closely related to Hebrew, Syriac, and Phoenician, and was written in a script derived from the Phoenician alphabet. So already off the bat, they're telling you that Aramaic is very closely related to Hebrew. So they are very similar languages coming out of the same group of Shemitic languages. And the Hebrew language also translation to using the Phoenician alphabet at a certain period of time as well. So they are very closely related. Aramaic is thought to have first appeared among the Arameans around the late 11th century BCE. By the 8th century BCE, it had become accepted by the Assyrians as a second language. The mass deportations of people by the Assyrians and the use of Aramaic as a lingua franca by Babylonian merchants served to spread the language, so that in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, it gradually supplanted Akkadian as the lingua franca of the Middle East. It subsequently became the official language of the Achaemenid Persian dynasty, though after the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek displaced it as the official language throughout the former Persian Empire. So we have here that Aramaic, 11 centuries before the time of Christ, was beginning to be spoken by the Assyrians as a second language, and then eventually took over as their first language. So they used to speak Akkadian, but now Aramaic grew to be the most prominent language in the Middle East all the way up until the Persian dynasty here. So this is the Medo-Persian Empire. And this continued all the way up until Alexander the Great basically allowed the Greek Empire to rise to power. So, and even after Alexander the Great had risen to power, Aramaic had already been such a popular dialect that it was still being spoken in many places, although they were trying to start implementing Greek as more of the imperial dialect. So, Aramaic dialects survived into Roman times. However, particularly in Palestine and Syria, Aramaic had replaced Hebrew as a language of the Jews as early as the 6th century BCE. Certain portions of the Bible, i.e. the books of Daniel and Ezra, are written in Aramaic, as are the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. Among the Jews, Aramaic was used by the common people, while Hebrew remained the language of religion and government and of the upper class. Jesus and the apostles are believed to have spoken Aramaic, and Aramaic language translations of the Old Testament circulated. Aramaic continued in wide use until about 650 CE, when it was supplanted by Arabic. So this is a hugely important paragraph right here. So we see here that 6 centuries before Christ is born, or before Yeshua Hamashiach is born, we see that Aramaic is being spoken much more commonly than Hebrew. So by the 6th century, more Hebrews were speaking Aramaic than they were speaking Hebrew. And as you can see here, even portions of Daniel and the book of Ezra are written in Aramaic, and those are much older books than the New Testament. And then we also see here that among the Jews, or among the Hebrew people, Aramaic was used by the common people, right? So it was the local dialect. While Hebrew remained the language of religion and government and of the upper class. So if you can recall here that while Rome had jurisdiction over the area of Israel, so they had a governor, and Pilate Pontius was the governor of that area. However, they also still had their own governance of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priests and all that. So that was like the Hebrew governance. So the religious sectors and also the government of the Hebrew people and the upper class all spoke this Hebrew religious dialect, while a lot of the Roman imperial, governmental, and business transactions would be spoken in Greek, and Aramaic was spoken most commonly as a local dialect. Now, we will not just have one witness for this, but two. So this is another just synopsis. This is from Wikipedia. Quick synopsis of Aramaic. We'll only be reading a little bit of this. So we have Old Aramaic. Imperial Aramaic is a Shemitic language that originated among the Arameans in the ancient region of Syria. During its 3,000-year-long history, Aramaic went through several stages of development. It has served as a language of public life and administration of ancient kingdoms and empires, and also as a language of divine worship and religious study. It subsequently branched into several Neo-Aramaic languages that are still spoken in modern times. The Aramaic language belongs to the northwest group of the Shemitic language family, which also includes the Canaanite languages such as Hebrew, Edomite, Moabite, and Phoenician, as well as Amorite and Ugaritic. Aramaic languages are written in the Aramaic alphabet, which was derived from the Phoenician alphabet. One of the most prominent variants of the Aramaic alphabet still used in modern times is the Syriac alphabet. The Aramaic alphabet also became a base for the creation and adaptation of specific writing systems in some other Shemitic languages, thus becoming the precursor of the Hebrew alphabet and the Arabic alphabet. From the short synopsis here, we can see once again that Aramaic comes out of these Shemitic languages in the Middle East, in the area that is now known as the Middle East, and which also includes Hebrew and some other languages, and Phoenician. Again, these all go back to Phoenician because the Phoenician alphabet became quite popular to be used by many different languages that branched out of these Canaanite families or Shemitic families. And so Hebrew eventually adopted the Phoenician alphabet instead of pictographs, and then the Aramaic language also eventually adopted the Phoenician language to develop their own alphabet. And so it says that Aramaic is a precursor to the Hebrew alphabet, referring to the square script or the block script, which became one of the more recent Hebrew alphabets to come about. And we'll talk about the development of the Hebrew language and its transition of alphabetic letters later. But this is not saying that Aramaic came before Hebrew, but that the Aramaic alphabet eventually was adopted in a more modern version of Hebrew that we see today. Okay, so lastly, we'll be looking at this Wikipedia search here. When you Google, what language did Yeshua speak, they will tell you. On each one of these sites, we have Briticana, which told us that Jesus and the apostles are believed to have spoken Aramaic. And then we also have Wikipedia. So these are mainstream, really easy to access sources that as soon as you do a search, they will explicitly tell you that he was speaking Aramaic. He was not speaking Hebrew. He was speaking Aramaic. Although well, let's just read this article. So, the language of Jesus and his disciples is believed to be Aramaic. This is the common language of Judea in the 1st century AD. Most likely a Galilean dialect distinguishable from that of Jerusalem. This is generally agreed upon by historians. The village of Nazareth and Capernaum in Galilee, where Jesus spent most of his time, were Aramaic-speaking communities. It is also likely that Yeshua knew enough Koine Greek to converse with those not native to Judea, and it is reasonable to assume that Yeshua was well versed in Hebrew for religious purposes. So this tells you right here. Not only was he speaking Aramaic, was this the most common language to be spoken during his life as a man on earth, but that the communities he was going to were mostly Aramaic speaking communities. And not only that, but he also did know some Greek as well as Hebrew for specific purposes, but he was mostly speaking Aramaic. So based on probability and deductive reasoning, I think we can pretty much assume with confidence that when he spoke Eli Eli Lama Sabachtani, he was not speaking Hebrew, but he was speaking Aramaic. So it is very important here. And not only do we know he's speaking Aramaic, so when this came out of his mouth, so this is an English translation of Aramaic words, but we also know, that this language of Aramaic had two distinct dialects. And the first is a Galilean dialect, which Yeshua spoke, and is distinguishable from the Aramaic dialect that was spoken in Jerusalem. So there were two, different dialects being spoken during the life of Yeshua Hamashiach. And the first was known as the northern dialect of Aramaic, and this was spoken in the land of Galilee, right? And we see Nazareth, where Yeshua is native to, or where he is from, is in the region of Galilee. So he spoke this northern Aramaic dialect. And this is distinguishable from that of Jerusalem. So from this southern area down here, Jerusalem we see in this region of Judea. So this southern region of Israel had a distinct dialect of Aramaic that was different from the northern dialect. So this explains why in Matthew chapter 27 and in Mark chapter 15, when he spoke Eli Eli Lama Sabachtani, those who were around said, "Oh, he calls for Elijah." Even they didn't know what he was saying because he was being crucified in southern Israel, in this region of Judea, right outside Jerusalem in Golgotha. So he was speaking this northern dialect that was misheard by those who were more used to a southern dialect. And these dialects are just like accents, and we can see this even in America. So people from the south have a very distinct dialect than those from the north, which have a different accent or dialect, even though we all speak the same language. And although you can understand each other, certain nuances, certain idioms, certain ways people pronounce words can get misunderstood. And real quick, I just want to show this. Oops. Here we go. So he cries, right, with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, Lama Sabachtani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of those who stood by when they heard it said, Behold, he calleth for Elijah, because they didn't know what he was saying. They could not understand, being in this southern region of Judea. So even those people around didn't fully comprehend what he was speaking. So, what he was speaking. And then on top of that, those who translated this into the English language, those who put in, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? they interpret this phrase as, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Because they will say that Yeshua was speaking Hebrew. And if he was speaking Hebrew, then he must be quoting from Psalms 22. And if we can remember Psalms 22 here, or we've got Psalms 22 up actually. If we have Psalms 22 here, let's look at the transliteration for Psalms 22 real quick. Why not? And see what it is. So, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? In Psalms 22 is El Ma Azab. Does that sound like Eli Eli Lama Sabachtani? El Ma Azab? That seems like it could be a stretch. I'm not particularly sure, although kind of similar as a transliteration. This is a transliteration right here in English from a Hebrew word, but this is a transliteration from an Aramaic word. And remember, based on both the Britannica and Wikipedia searches, they did tell us that Aramaic is very similar to the Hebrew language. So although kind of similar, I wouldn't say that Ma Azab is the same as Lama Sabachtani. Totally different. And based on these search engines as well, they tell us that Yeshua spoke Aramaic. And not only that, but we know that he was speaking in northern dialect of Aramaic. And so with this, we have a couple questions to ask. And the first is, why was this sentence transliterated? The second is, what language was the New Testament written in? And the third question we have is, what language did Yeshua Hamashiach speak? And some of these we've already answered. So why was this sentence transliterated? Well, it was to preserve the sound, the pronunciation of what he was saying, rather than the meaning. Now, what languages were the New Testament written in? Well, since most of the apostles were speaking Aramaic, it was actually written in Aramaic. And then in Alexandria and Egypt, we see translations of the New Testament into Greek. And same with the Old Testament. It's where we get the Septuagint, is the first Greek translation of the Bible there. And then also later it got translated into Latin. But it was actually originally written in Aramaic. And then what language did Yeshua HaMashiach speak? Well, we know this for a fact. It's definitely Aramaic, the same language as the apostles spoke.